Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, of course. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation, and we are very pleased today to unite our PON community in celebration of The Art of Diplomacy by Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who we will be introducing in just a moment. But first, let me say a very warm welcome to all of our participants joining from all across the world. I see where you're coming from in the chat, and it is such a pleasure. And a special welcome to those joining from just next door, because we are delighted to partner with the Harvard Law School Association of Massachusetts, led by another former ambassador, Barry B. White. So a special welcome to that group today. As so many of you know, for 40 years now, the Program on Negotiation has led the world in research and curriculum and teaching on topics related to negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And we are delighted to present a series of live virtual events, such as this one, featuring illustrious speakers, celebrating new works and learning together. So for today's event, we are very pleased to welcome Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who has a long career over several administrations, and we will be introducing in greater detail. To do that, we will also be welcoming, and I'll invite them both to turn on their cameras right now, Professor Robert Mnookin, who is the former chair of the Program on Negotiation, which he led for over 25 years. And it's so great to have him back at the helm to moderate this event. Bob is the Samuel Williston Professor of Law Emeritus here at Harvard Law School and a very active member of our community. So without further ado, I will hand over the virtual Zoom microphone to our celebrated speakers and thank them both for being with us today. Professor Mnookin.
Well, what a thrill to introduce Stuart Eizenstat. Among other things, Stuart is, of course, a graduate of the Harvard Law School, 1967. And indeed, he was the recipient of PON's Great Negotiator Award in 2004 because of his remarkable efforts at Holocaust compensation negotiations with the Swiss banks and the governments of Switzerland, Germany, France, and much of Europe. Really a stunning set of achievements. He has had a just incredible career in terms of public service. And in one way or another, he has served in 6 administrations, I believe all Democratic administrations, going back to LBJ, but he might want to correct me on
Trump also, Bob.
I'm sorry?
Trump also.
Trump also. In all events, he grew up in Atlanta, where, among other things, he was a high school basketball star. Indeed, he was an honorable mention All-American high school basketball player. But I noticed that when he went to the University of North Carolina, where he was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate in political science, he was not on the basketball team, and his resume doesn't list a varsity letter from UNC. He served full-time during both the Carter administration and the Clinton administration. During President Carter's administration, at a remarkably young age, he served as President Carter's chief domestic policy advisor for 4 years in the White House. For President Clinton, he also served during both terms, first as the US ambassador to the European Union, and then as Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, later as Undersecretary of State for Economic Business and Agricultural Affairs, and finally as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. The book I just commend to everyone in the audience. It's a remarkable book that presents a detailed exploration of critical diplomatic negotiations involving the United States during the last 50 years and the actions of the American officials involved. It documents both the successes, for example, Henry Kissinger's opening to China and disengagement agreements following the Yom Kippur War, the remarkable work relating to German unification by President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker, and George Mitchell's Good Friday Accords and Richard Holbrooke's work ending the wars in the Balkans. But he also deals with our failures, and these are negotiations relating to American wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. This beautifully written book represents, and I want to underscore this, an important intellectual contribution. Eizenstat conducted some 150 interviews with the participants, including interviews with the former secretaries of state, defense, and presidents who were involved. Indeed, I'm proud as a Harvard Law School professor to report that his book contains 91 pages of footnotes. So it's well documented apart from being well written. Stuart, welcome back to the program on negotiation. We're proud to have you.
Professor Mnookin, Bob, thank you so much. It's really a thrill to be back, and I'm most appreciative of the invitation to address your PON group, and want to thank Nicole Bryant for her role, and my classmate at Harvard Law School, Barry White, who's president of the Harvard Law School Association of Massachusetts, for co-sponsoring this. I wrote this book for 3 reasons. The first is that we live in turbulent times in which we are facing seemingly insoluble problems. And I wanted to show how over the past 50 years, American diplomacy and leadership had solved equally daunting problems and can do so again in the future. Second, we are in the midst of hot wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and the threat of conflict hovers over Taiwan. And we've gone through in our lifetimes wars with, in many cases, unsatisfactory endings. Vietnam, the 2 Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, the 2 Iraq wars under Presidents Bush I and Bush II, Afghanistan, which was our longest war in American history, obviously ending in a very unsatisfactory way, and the war in Libya, which President Obama called his worst mistake as president. And so with all of that, I wanted in this book to take a hard look at whether, when, and how military force can be an effective element in diplomacy and when it cannot. And third, there is, I fear, a growing isolationism in the United States, a retreat from our leadership, a desire to hide ourselves behind our 2 oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And that would be catastrophic, as it was between World War I and World War II, when we had isolationism. It creates a vacuum into which the Russias, Chinas, and Irans, and others with very different interests and values will fill, and we will have a much more conflicted world than we have today without U.S. leadership. The book is based on 130 interviews, as Professor Mnookin mentioned. And the art of diplomacy is the art of convincing the other nation, or nations if you're dealing with more than one, that it's in their national interest to accept what is in America's national interest, to find that correct bridge between their interests and our interest. Because diplomacy and diplomatic agreements are not a game of poker. It's not a winner take all. It has to be a win-win situation, because the other country has to go back to their president, to their government, to their publics to sell what they agree to. The starting point for a successful negotiation is the president appointing the right negotiator at the right time on the right issue. So it's almost inconceivable that we would have had the kind of opening to China without Henry Kissinger, who wrote the foreword to my book, by the way, one of the last things he wrote, or German reunification without Jim Baker, who wrote the preface to the book, the Good Friday Agreement without George Mitchell, Camp David between Israeli and Egyptian leaders without Jimmy Carter, or the Dayton Accords finally ending the war in Bosnia without my great late friend Richard Holbrooke. But I want to make it clear that it's not sufficient to have the right negotiator. The right negotiator can't come in on a white horse, wave a wand, and solve every problem unless the countries themselves have a desire to reach a common goal. And we see in the Gaza war that is not the case, where there's such starkly different end games that Hamas and Israel want. Nevertheless, having the right negotiator is critical. And I found in my interviews a common set of skills that they brought to the negotiating table. The first was a willingness to seize a historic opportunity and a fierce determination to make it succeed, to recognize when there is a historical moment. For example, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, which no one anticipated, President Bush and Jim Baker decided very early on that what they wanted to achieve was a united Germany, East and West, in NATO. This was an enormously hard lift because all of our World War II allies had very different views. The Soviets had lost 20 million troops and people in World War II, and the last thing they wanted was a strong, united Germany, and certainly not in NATO. Even Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK and one of the occupying powers of West Germany at the time, said, I love Germany so much, I want two of them. So having this as a goal was critically important, but very difficult. But nevertheless, they carried it to the end, seeing that this was a historical moment. Second, great negotiators bring courage. And by that, I don't mean the courage of a soldier on the battlefield, but the courage to take political risks, to break from your own political basis, to make decisions which may not be popular with your public, but which advance the process of peace. A great example is, of course, Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, coming to Jerusalem and pledging no more wars. More recently, the Crown Prince of the UAE, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, doing the normalization with Israel, which was not popular at home. And most poignantly, in some respects, was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, in which Catholic and Protestant leaders, the Unionists and Nationalists, who had fought bitterly for 20-year civil war, which the British, in great British understatement, called the Troubles. Well, the Troubles led to 3,500 people killed and tens of thousands maimed. And finally, the leaders had the courage to say, enough is enough. We've got to find a peaceful way out. Third is a high degree of intelligence, mixed with wisdom and good judgment. Here, Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai of China, and the opening to China and the Shanghai Communique are prime examples. Next is certainly something we learned from Harvard Law School, preparation. In fact, Bob Lighthizer, President Trump's trade representative, said to me the three most important attributes he brought to the negotiating table were preparation, preparation, and preparation. Knowing the issues upside down and backwards so well, not just yours, but the other side's, that you can find the areas of compromise. Next is an attribute that people oftentimes don't have, and that is the ability to listen to the other side and put yourself in their shoes. Sometimes you get so wrapped up in negotiating that you're hearing yourself talk and not really listening to what the other side is saying and how they're saying it. Is this their bottom line? Are they just talking from talking points? And then putting yourself in their shoes. What Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, and when I was deputy secretary of the Treasury, he was the secretary, called unsympathetic empathy. Example, the 73 Yom Kippur War, Israel is on its heels. It counterattacks with U.S. help in terms of arms and planes. And it has the Third Army of Egypt surrounded in the Egyptian Sinai. And Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, had taken tremendous flack politically for the surprise attack on Yom Kippur of 73. And so she wanted to eliminate and exterminate that Third Army. It was the cream of Sadat's army. Kissinger, standing in Sadat's shoes, says, Golda, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. If you humiliate Sadat, he'll never make peace with you. And that persuaded her to let the Third Army off and led to the later successes in the disengagement talks and ultimately Camp David. I want to give one other example that is very personal to me in terms of preparation. We're in our 13th and last day at Camp David between Sadat and Begin. And Begin comes to Carter in his lodge and says, Mr. President, I will not make any more compromises. I want you to get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting. I'm going home. I'm sorry. The President, realizing that this would totally undermine Sadat's courageous trip to Jerusalem and be a huge blow to his own prestige, remembered from his preparation by reading the CIA profiles of Sadat and Begin thoroughly, that Begin had a soft spot in his heart for his 8 grandchildren. So he has 8 copies of the original photo of the 3 of them on day 1 taken, puts the names of each grandchild, then hands them to Begin at his cabin. And here's Begin vocalize the names of each with best wishes from Jimmy Carter for peace. His eyes start to tear, his lips quiver. He puts down his suitcase and he says, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last try. Another attribute that's critical is trust, building trust in your negotiating partner by developing a personal relationship with him, not seeing him as an adversary or her to be defeated and humiliated. So at a tough time during the German reunification talks, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, invites Edvard Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister, to get away from Washington, away from Moscow, away from the press, and go to his lodge at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And there they bonded for a couple of days, talking about the future of Europe, their children's hopes for peace, their grandchildren's hopes for peace. And this personal touch was tremendously important in changing Shevardnadze's attitude and ultimately Gorbachev's. Next, I call this the art of diplomacy. And there is an art, like an artist painting on an easel. You have to be creative in negotiations because there's always going to be a point at which you seem to hit a brick wall that you can't get over or around. And this is where creativity, often by using ambiguous language that both sides can interpret in their own way, is necessary. So, at the Good Friday talks, George Mitchell is confronted with a situation in which, in the midst of the talks, the militias are still killing each other. And many of the other political parties said, this is crazy. we can't have a negotiation for peace while we're killing each other. But those militias would not give up their guns. They were so suspicious of the other side. And so in a creative action, what became known as the Mitchell Principles said, okay, you can keep your arms, but you have to agree in writing that you're going to try to solve this problem by peaceful means. And that did the trick. Next, with the baseball playoffs in full measure, a baseball analogy, which is don't swing for a home run or you'll strike out. Go for limited agreements that you can build on. So at Camp David, we did not have the Palestinians there. They absented themselves by not accepting UN Resolution 242, land for peace. And we had therefore only a bilateral agreement with Egypt, but it's lasted for over 40 years, even through the Gulf Wars and the war in Gaza. And the Good Friday Agreement didn't resolve the two most important issues. First, what's the future of Northern Ireland? Is it going to be part of the Irish Republic, or is it going to stay as part of Great Britain? Well, in Good Friday, the agreement was achieved without resolving that, but leaving it to a later referendum, which has never been held, because the two sides are satisfied not taking the risk of an adverse referendum with the fact that they've now peacefully integrated. Next, another sports analogy, this time from the Olympics, and that is stamina. A great negotiator has to have stamina. You have to look at international negotiations as a marathon that can last not just days, not just weeks, not just months, but years. And it always ends with a sprint at the end at 3 o'clock in the morning. The whole notion of shuttle diplomacy came when Henry Kissinger spent 2 weeks shuttling between Egypt, Israel, and Syria with virtually no sleep. Jimmy Carter got an average of 2 hours sleep at Camp David. When I was negotiating the Kyoto protocols on global warming, I got 3 or 4 hours of sleep. Next is the use of back channels. There are many times when the two parties are so antagonistic that they won't get in the same room with each other, like the PLO and Israel before the Oslo Accords, or even today, Hamas and Israel in Gaza. And so it's important to find back channels that will allow you to talk more informally. That's how the 1993 Oslo Accords of mutual recognition by the PLO and Israel occurred. It remarkably occurred without the knowledge of the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin. When he was presented with the results of this informal discussion, they were fearful he wouldn't accept it, but he did. When we were negotiating the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, John Kerry, in effect, used a back channel, going through the Sultan of Oman, Kubas, who had good relations with both Iran and the US, and that laid the groundwork for what became a successful negotiation. Next, and this has real currency with the 2024 election, and that is, don't abandon your predecessor's agreements, but build on them. We are often an unreliable negotiating partner. Let me give you two polar opposites. We lost, that is, Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election decisively to Ronald Reagan. And one of the issues he used against us was the SALT II nuclear agreement with the Soviet Union, which he said gave them too much and we got too little. And yet, he did not abandon it, indeed implemented it for the full term when he was president, even though it was not ratified by the Senate, because he knew that disturbing the status quo that had been achieved by his predecessor would have risk. And he built on it by a later START talk with even deeper cuts. Contrast that with what President Trump did with the JCPOA nuclear agreement with Iran. Passed in 2015, Iran never violated its terms. He pulls out in 2018, says we're going to apply maximum pressure and get a better deal. And instead of a better deal, what we now have is 60% enriched uranium, near weapons grade instead of 2.5%, brand new modern centrifuges in lieu of the 2/3 that were destroyed under the agreement, the reinstitution of the plutonium plant at Iraq, which was cemented over. So it's always risky. And one of the problems we have also, which will be very much a part of this whoever wins the election, is climate change that I was involved in. When the Republican presidents are in, whether it's George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, or Trump, they withdraw from major commitments. When the Democrats are in, they come back with major commitments. And the Paris agreements, which is the keystone to the solution, is at risk depending on who wins the election in 2024. Last, the important attribute of using leverage. In a way, we choose leverage every day with our spouses, our partners, our children, our grandchildren, our business associates. But a great negotiator has to use leverage in a proper way. And there are two types of leverage. There's positive leverage. For example, when the UAE was negotiating normalization with Israel, what put it over the top was not something Israel gave, it's something the United States gave, which is F-35 fighter jets. The negative leverage is in three forms: economic sanctions, which we have in more countries, in more instances, than all the other countries combined have against each other. It's our sort of fallback when we don't know what else to do. And I was in charge of sanctions in the Clinton administration, but they're not as effective as they used to be. We don't have a monopoly. They haven't changed the conduct of Iran or Russia or Maduro in Venezuela, for example. It's too easy to get out of them. Second is the threat of war. 1994, President Clinton sends former President Carter, Colin Powell, and Sam Nunn, Senator Nunn, to Haiti to convince the military dictator who had thrown out the elected prime minister to cede his position so the prime minister could come back. And he refused until Bill Clinton sent aircraft from the United States and about to land in Haiti, and he got the message and left. Third and most drastic is the actual use of military force. No president, and again, I've served with many of them, wants to commit, unless he has to, the lives of men and women in combat. It's the toughest decision a president has to make. And there are several lessons that I've drawn from my interviews, which included, by the way, many of the generals who led the fight and the wars I've mentioned. Number one, it should be the last option after exhausting all others. Negotiating first, economic sanctions, threats of military force, only use it when everything else doesn't work. Second, only use it if it's really in the supreme national interest of the United States with a good chance of success. Now, there are terrible things happening in the world all the time. Today, in Sudan, for example, there is a horrible genocide occurring. Tens of thousands of people are being slaughtered by the Arab Sudanese against the Black Sudanese. But it's not in our direct supreme national interest to get involved directly. Next, and this is critically important in the Gaza fight, and I got this third lesson from Steve Hadley, who was President George W. Bush's national security advisor during the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and from Condoleezza Rice, his Secretary of State. And that is, before you shoot the first bullet, know what your political objective is and make sure it's achievable. As Steve Hadley said to me, we often do it backward. We go in militarily and then think what political objective we have. And this is exactly what's happened in Gaza today. After 13 months of fighting, there is no clear political objective that the Israeli government has. Next, if you're going to use military force, understand the internal dynamics, the culture, and the history of the country before you invade. As General David Petraeus, who turned around the Iraq War, said, you really need to have a nuanced understanding of a country before you invade, and we did not have that in Afghanistan or in Iraq. We didn't realize what it would mean to depose Saddam, who was a terrible dictator for sure, but a minority Sunni dictator and a majority Shiite country. Next, recognize the barriers to success, the costs, the challenges. So in Afghanistan, we really didn't appreciate till many years later that Pakistan was acting as a refuge for the Taliban, where they could rest, reload, and come back. In addition, Mike Tyson, great heavyweight champion, once said, everyone has a great plan going into the ring until you get punched in the nose by the other side. Well, in Kosovo, in 1999, in the Balkan War, it took 77 days of bombing of Serbia to bring the negotiating table by NATO. One of those days mistakenly involved a bomb on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing several Chinese diplomats. Obviously an accident, but from China's perspective, to this day, they think it was done on purpose. Next, if you're going to use military force, in Colin Powell's words to me, make it decisive. Two examples of polar opposites. Bush 1, George H.W. Bush, and Colin Powell used decisive force in getting Saddam's forces out of Kuwait and back across the border to Iraq. He got a UN resolution authorizing force. He got a NATO resolution authorizing force. He got a congressional resolution authorizing force. He got 38 countries to contribute a total of 500,000 troops. Really decisive and overwhelming. Contrast that with his son 12 years later, who missed all of those lessons. No UN resolution, no NATO resolution, and a very thin coalition. In fact, his Secretary of Defense said, we're going to use a light footprint in Iraq, and actually drew down forces from Afghanistan so that we didn't have decisive force in either theater, in either Afghanistan or Iraq. And last, if you're going to use military force, it should be with good intelligence. This is essential. And let me give you 3 quick examples and then I'll close. We all remember that we went into Iraq in the Second Iraq War because of supposed weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had, and we found none. Well, I made the finding in my own research for this book that Saddam actually did have weapons of mass destruction. He didn't have them at the time of the invasion, but he did have them before, and he destroyed them in accordance with UN resolutions and mandates. Well, okay, if that was the case, why didn't he say so and save his own life and his own regime and the lives of thousands of Iraqi and US soldiers? And the reason is he feared that if he said he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction, his domestic opponents and his greatest threat, Iran, might invade. A second intelligence failure occurred on our watch in the Carter administration. And that is, the Shah of Iran was our man in that area of the world. 6 presidents had given him an open shopping list of every weapon he might want. And yet, 6 weeks before he was forcibly required to leave the throne and his country, 6 weeks, The CIA reported, and I have the document now, it'll be classified. CIA reported that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even in a pre-revolutionary state. Now, a president can't make sound decisions when he gets that kind of intelligence. Indeed, they didn't realize that the Shah, our, again, principal ally, had incurable cancer and was not making good decisions. And taking that to Gaza, and with this I'll close and just conclude. Dennis Ross and I co-chair, he's Ambassador Ross, he does decades of Middle East negotiating, and he and I are co-chairs of a think tank in Jerusalem. And we had briefings from two Israeli generals who said that this was one of the greatest intelligence failures in Israeli history. Because, they said, we did not realize that Hamas had transformed itself from a terrorist group into a full-blown terrorist army. 30 to 40,000 men, organized by battalions, heavily armed with modern armaments by Iran and by their own capabilities. And they said, we knew they had tunnels, but we had no idea that they had up to 300 miles of tunnels, some as deep as 25 stories. So good intelligence is absolutely essential for these military force. So can conclude, to strengthen American diplomacy in the 21st century, we need to enhance our economic and military capability, but we need one other thing, and that is to nourish our democratic institutions and to reduce the bitter polarization we have at home. So when a diplomat speaks abroad for the United States, he's speaking for a united country. Putin can see with his own eyes that's not the case with Ukraine. There is no higher purpose than the U.S. using its greatest assets and its engaged diplomacy to reduce conflicts and meet our 21st century challenges. The alternative, withdrawing from leadership, is will lead to an even more unstable and lawless world. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Nicole and Barry White. I'd be glad to take your questions.
What a wonderful presentation, Stu. I think encapsulating your generalizations at the end of the book about advice you give. And it's sound advice indeed. I wonder if we could begin with a question first about one of the present conflicts, and that's Ukraine. What do you think the prospects are for a negotiated resolution in Ukraine? What do you see as the principal barriers? And what do you think the posture of the United States should be?
So Henry Kissinger, in his interview, told me, Bob, that you can only achieve at the negotiating table what you win on the battlefield. And that's why it's so important to arm Ukraine with the most modern weapons possible so they can take back as much of their country as Russia has taken. But to be realistic, we have to realize that they're not going to get it all back. They just don't have the manpower to overcome the Russians, although the Russians have lost 300,000 casualties, at least 100,000 killed and 200,000 wounded. So I think that the ultimate resolution of this war, which will come, I think, within a year, when both sides realize they can't achieve anything more on the battlefield, it will not be a formal peace treaty, in my opinion. I think it will be something akin to the 1953 Korean War armistice between North Korea and South Korea, with a demilitarized zone in between. Now, despite having no treaty, North and South Korea have never fought in 70 years. And in this armistice, and this is one of the reasons I think a treaty would be difficult, We should keep sanctions on Russia. We should not recognize any of Russia's illegal acquisition of Ukrainian territory, which in a formal peace treaty would certainly be required. In addition, one really critical factor is not to negotiate behind Zelensky's back. And I am afraid that that will happen. In fact, Donald Trump has just said this very week, that within 24 hours of being elected, that he will go directly to Russia. Now, we did this twice. In the Vietnam War, for which Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Prize, as did his North Korean counterpart, we negotiated without Saigon being in the room. Literally, they were not there, the government we had fought for. And second, in addition to that, in the negotiations in the Trump and Biden administrations with the Taliban, the Afghan government, Gandhi's government, was not in the negotiating room. And then we said, well, God, how come they fell when we left? They weren't a party to the negotiations. We can't do that for Zelensky. And last, and this is most difficult, I talked about putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Let's put ourselves in Zelensky's shoes, okay? Everybody's bloodied. He finally gets to the negotiating table and he says, you Americans have a saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. They've been fooled twice. In 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, they gave up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for Russian promises that they wouldn't invade any of their territory, which Putin, violated. Second, the second time was when the fighting broke out in Crimea and in the Donbass area, as they're fighting today. There was a ceasefire agreement reached called the Minsk Agreement. We, the United States, were party to that, and we assured, that's the term that was used, gave assurances to Ukraine against any Russian invasion further into their territory. So let's go to fast forward. Those were done in 2014 and 2015. Let's fast forward to 2022. 3 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 3 days before, Putin says publicly, Minsk is no more. He just tore it up. So Zelensky's going to say, well, wait a minute now, how do I know a third time that he simply won't rest and reload? Now, there's no good answer to that, but I think the following should be done. First, Biden has properly already negotiated, just within the last 6 weeks, a 10-year military agreement with Ukraine. Not to come to their defense, but to provide military support. Will that prevail depending on who wins the election? And I hope that Germany and the UK and France do the same. So at least they have the arms to try to defend themselves. Second, membership in the European Union, to which I was ambassador. I think it would be very difficult for Putin to invade an EU country, even though there's no mutual defense agreement. And third is there are currently about 150 NATO trainers in Ukraine. Perhaps if they stayed, it would be a bit of a tripwire for Putin. None of those are guarantees unless there's NATO membership, which is, if it happens at all, a long way down the road.
I guess you said a lot of things that I think are very important. And I think the most important one really goes to this very difficult question of what security guarantees will Ukraine have in order to make the deal you describe, which is in fact to accept the status quo in terms of territorial control.
Yes, and that's the very point I'm making, is that he's twice been tricked.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
so, you know,
And the example you didn't mention, by the way, was Munich,
yes,
which was perhaps the most conspicuous example, where Great Britain and France, without the participation of Czechoslovakia,
yes,
gave
and
away part of the country.
in fact, I would go so far as to say that if we pull the rug out from under Ukraine, and remember, it took 6 months for the House of Representatives to finally pass the $40 billion package with an administration that wanted it. So we're really in a position where it could be Munich 2, Bob, where we just pull the rug out, we've given enough, you're on your own, and, good Lord, what happens then?
Well, as a follow-up, I guess I'd love your perspective on the risks of a Trump presidency with respect to NATO and its coherence.
Well, he's already said that any country that doesn't have the 2% of GDP for defense spending, and he didn't just say, we're going to do more to try to encourage you. He said, I would say to Putin, go to them, go at them. I mean, this is a quite remarkable thing. So during his first term, he was already very, very shaky on NATO commitments, said it was obsolete. And I think that the whole future of NATO would be in question.
Let's turn to a perhaps even more complicated and difficult war presently going on in the Middle East. What are your observations with respect to the hostilities in Gaza, in Lebanon, and of course between Israel and Iran?
Well, first is we have to recognize the brutality of the attack that started the war by Hamas. Hamas needs to be disabled as a military and governing force, and they have been. We're now in a position where the military leadership of Israel believes that they have been defeated sufficiently so they can't govern and can't be a real military threat. Now, can they be a guerrilla force? Yes, that's what they're doing right now. It's absolutely what they're doing right now, but not as a direct threat to Israel. Next, all wars should combine diplomacy, and particularly this one. And that's what's been the missing element. The military force without a diplomatic component. So Sinwar is killed. Much of their leadership is dismantled. And yet the Prime Minister of Israel is going back very hard at Gaza. Now, here is a lesson that I learned from General Petraeus, and this was commented on just yesterday. Petraeus helped turn around the Iraq War after 10 years by what he called 3 points: clear, hold, and build. Clear meant you clear out the terrorists. Hold meant you hold the territory that you've cleared. And third, build means you try to convince the civilian non-combatants that life will be better for them without the kind of leadership they had before. And you put in place policies to do that. In fact, he had a sign on his office, General Petraeus, that said, how many Iraqi civilians have you helped today? Well, Israel's cleared areas, but they're not holding them. In fact, there was really an analysis just yesterday of the mystery of why, for example, in the north, they had cleared the area, but they didn't keep sufficient troops there to hold it. And they certainly have done nothing to build. So that's important. And then last, and maybe most important, is, in my mind, Gaza needs to be put into a broader diplomatic context, by which I mean that Israel's greatest security is to be part of a coalition of moderate Sunni Arab countries. And they already have peace agreements with Jordan, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and will have them, I'm convinced, within a year or two with Saudi Arabia, and a coalition against Iran's axis of resistance with their Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas and militias in Syria and Iraq. Israel cannot take Iran on itself. It has to be embedded in that kind of coalition. But the price, Bob, the condition for that to happen is some solution to the Palestinian issue. Now, it doesn't have to be a Palestinian state tomorrow, but it has to have some kind of self-determination. It can be conditional, it can take place over time, there can be security assurances, but without that, I fear that these moderate Arab countries that have peace agreements with Israel will not join in a formal coalition. And in fact, Iran is now wooing those very countries. Just within the last week, they had meetings with them trying to pull them away from Israel. So this is really absolutely critical.
Let me just ask a couple questions from our audience. One asks the following. You mentioned intelligence. Considering your extensive experience in diplomacy, how do intelligence services influence the negotiation process? And what balance should be struck between intelligence gathering and diplomatic transparency to ensure successful international agreements?
That's a great question. Well, first, let's take this administration, the Biden administration. Bill Burns, who's a very close friend, Deputy Secretary of State, he was ambassador to Jordan, is the CIA director. Interestingly, it's he, not any State Department figure, who has been the principal negotiator with Iraq, with Qatar and Egypt for some deal on the hostages and a ceasefire. Now, that is an unusual position. Bill is an unusually gifted person. The CIA's role with respect to diplomacy is to provide the most accurate analysis of where the points of agreement and disagreement are, of analyzing who the leaders are, of giving you a perspective on where public opinion is. And that's their role. It's not to be an advocate. It's not to be at the negotiating table, but it's to supply the negotiators with the intelligence, with the preparation, so that you can make the sound decisions based on that wisdom. And so that's really critical. And that's, again, what was missing in Iran when we were dealing with them. And it's what was missing with Israel before they went into warfare. I mean, it's so stunning. I mean, I've probably gone to Israel 50 times. And I do want to come back to one thing that what could have been. And the Mossad is tremendously talented. I mean, they knew that Haniyeh was the Hamas leader was in Tehran. They knew exactly where, in their limited strike 48 hours ago, the key military facilities were. They knew where the leaders of Lebanon were. And yet they didn't have any perspective on what was right next door in Gaza, what was going on for 2 years as they transformed themselves from a guerrilla force and a ragtag group into a full-blown army. And indeed, they actually had a woman analyst had the actual blueprint of what they were going to do, the gliders and everything. And as she passed it up the ranks, the higher-ups in the intelligence service said, there's no way that this ragtag group could pull something off this sophisticated. Now, I want to give you a perspective of what could have been and what still might. My last visit to the region, to the Middle East, was when I was both Undersecretary of State and then Deputy Treasury Secretary, and I was responsible for the economic dimension of the peace process. So I went in July of 2000 to Gaza, and what I saw was something beautiful, and I use that word advisedly. We had gotten Congress to pass a law called the Qualifying Industrial Zone, which allowed any country, any Arab country that had a peace agreement with Israel, at that time it was Jordan and Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, to create an industrial zone in which any company in that zone could ship back their products duty-free to the United States if they had as little as 10% Israeli content. What I saw was 30 plants employing 1,200 Gazans, and I saw the foundations of the second phase with another 30 plants. These were not Israeli plants. These were American plants, European plants, Japanese plants, Singaporean plants. And I went into one of them and I saw the product being loaded onto a flatbed truck. It went right through the Eretz crossing in Gaza to the airport that we got the Corps of Engineers to spend $1 billion on to have an airport for Gaza to export their products. There was one unarmed Israeli soldier overseeing this entire thing. One unarmed Israeli soldier. We had gotten unemployment in the West Bank down to 8%. We had gotten it down to 14% in Gaza. And then with the second Intifada, it all blew apart. I went back to see Arafat, in fact, after my visit, to tell him how thrilled we were and what more we were going to do. And he said, please tell your president, President Clinton, not to invite me to Camp David. And I said, why? He said, I'm not prepared to make the compromises he wants. Well, he was invited, it failed, the second Intifada occurred, and the rest is sad history. But one other thing needs to be said. 2005, a very tough, hardline Israeli Prime Minister, Eric Sharon, feels that it is futile for Israel to continue to occupy Gaza. He pulls every single IDF soldier out, and before they leave, they forcibly, and you can see the videos, forcibly pull 7,000 Israeli settlers out of Gaza. They leave all the infrastructure, the greenhouses, the industrial plant that I talked about, so the Palestinians would have a head start in rebuilding their country. No Israeli left at all, not one. And Hamas wins the next election, and instead of sending roses over to Israel, they send rockets.
Well, I want to thank you for what's been a remarkable presentation, and how grateful we are here at PON for the wonderful work you've done in your career and the advice and contributions you've made both in action and now in terms of scholarship as well. I think it's time.
Thank you for having me. It's been terrific.
Absolutely. I will echo what Bob said, and thank you, Ambassador Eizenstat, for taking the time to be with us and for all of this incredible learning, and of course, Professor Mnookin for expertly leading this discussion, which we know could have gone on for hours. And thank you to all of our participants, of course, for being here. If you had to join late, the full recording of this event, as with all the other events, will be up on our website in just a few days. I also strongly encourage you to get a copy of the book, The Art of Diplomacy. A link has been put in the chat for your convenience. A big thanks to the PON events team, who does all of the behind-the-scene work in making this happen. Laura Sampietro, Diane Long, Lindsay Sullivan, and you will see on our screen a list of our upcoming events. So we hope to see everyone very soon. Our next event is on Ukraine on November 4th. To delve deeper into the state of the conflict there. So thank you very much once again to Ambassador Eizenstat and Professor Mnookin. Thank you to the Harvard Law School Association of Massachusetts and Ambassador Barry B. White, and to all of our participants for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at another time. Thank you and be well.